Hello everyone, the Instant Camera Guy here, and welcome to another video. Have you ever had your classic Polaroid SX-70 and gone, you know what, I wish I could just meter it myself and manually control the exposure? Have you ever wanted to do that, but keep the camera looking completely original? Perhaps you've seen MiNT's Time Machine camera, which offers similar functionality, but perhaps you've gone, maybe I'd also like that on an autofocus Polaroid, such as the SX-70 sonar. Well, if you answered yes to these questions, boy do I have the product for you. This here is the SX-70R. It is a brand new PCB replacement for the SX-70 shutter, designed by Chinese Polaroid enthusiast Yongmin Liu, who also goes by the name Carlyle. Effectively, what Carlyle has done is make a brand new brain for the Polaroid SX-70. This replaces the camera's original electronics and adds a whole bunch of extra features and functionality. And so I've been meaning to make a video on this for quite a while, and I think the best time is now. Effectively, these have been out for a few months. Information about them is sort of fairly scarce at the moment. There's a few technicians that have been offering these conversions, myself included. But I think a lot of what these boards can do is sort of lost in translation. So what I really wanted to do was make a bit of a stream of consciousness, single take explanation as to what exactly these boards do, how you can get one for yourself, what kind of features they offer, what accessories you can use with them, etc., etc. So, as I was saying before, this is the product itself. Effectively, it is a board. The little green modules that you see on these PCBs are actually Bluetooth transmitters. And effectively what that allows is manual control over the shutter settings using Bluetooth. And there's two ways that you can do that. You can either use a dedicated phone app, which I will show you in a second, or you can use an optional dedicated dongle. And this dongle not only can control the shutter manually, but also adds some extra functions, which I'll talk about soon. Now, this PCB is not something that the average Polaroid shooter is necessarily going to be installing on their own. This is a very complex repair. It is not something that I would recommend trying at home unless you were very proficient at electronic servicing. There's a lot of work that goes into building a camera with one of these PCBs, and the PCB is not necessarily something you can drop into any old SX-70. The camera really has to be refurbished to the full before the new PCB is installed. And the reason that that is the case is these new PCBs are very high performance, and the rest of the camera really should be up to scratch if you're going to get the best out of the new PCB. You can kind of think about it like buying an old 1968 Mustang off a scrapyard that sat around for 40 years, completely untouched, and you decide to drop a 500 horsepower engine into it. Well, of course you can do that, but it's probably worth restoring the rest of the car too. You'd want to do the brakes and the chassis and the transmission, so that it can take advantage of that big powerful motor. And the SX-70 is kind of the same. So effectively that means that if you want one of these PCBs, you simply find a technician such as myself that knows how to install them. You send in your camera, we refurbish the camera, install the new PCB, calibrate the shutter, and then you end up with a wonderful camera to use. So, what exactly does this PCB do? Well, let's go through some of the features now. One of the first advantages to it is because it can use a phone app for manual control, it doesn't alter any of the cosmetics of the camera. Of course, you do have the dedicated dongle, which you can insert into the flash socket, but that Obviously keeps the lines looking very clean. It looks kind of like it's a factory accessory that you would have found back in the day. It doesn't alter the cosmetics all that much, but if you're a real purist, of course, you don't necessarily need to use the dongle. You can just simply use the Bluetooth app to control the camera instead. So for those where aesthetics are incredibly important, I really like this PCB. The other advantage to this PCB is, of course, it is brand new. It means that the 50-year-old electronics that are inside the original SX-70 no longer need to be relied on. Although SX-70 electronics are generally quite reliable, microchip failure can happen, and that can brick the cameras every now and again. So it's nice to know that we can purchase brand new, off-the-shelf components to replace them. So forgetting about the manual settings and all the Bluetooth override functionality, the one big advantage of this new PCB is when you're not using the Bluetooth, it works just like a regular SX-70. The new PCB by default is calibrated to take 600 type film, so that means that whatever SX-70 you install into gets all that advantage of that 640 ISO film with that higher sensitivity. It effectively means any SX-70 will perform identical to an SLR 680, giving really sharp photos in bright sun, and that higher ISO film allows for better performance in low light. The main thing that you'll notice, and I've just got an empty pack of film here so that I can demonstrate the camera running, when you close the door, the dark slide no longer ejects automatically. Now, that is by design, it's not a bug. Carlisle decided to code these PCBs to eject the dark slide when you feel that it should be ejected. Now that is very helpful if you're using external battery backs, which you can switch on separate to the camera. You may not want to put a pack of film in and turn the power on unless you're 100% ready. So yeah, he designed that in mind. So effectively, what you do instead is just like a Fuji Instax camera. All you have to do is just manually eject the dark slide when you feel like it. So there we go. That would have ejected the dark slide and the camera is now ready to use. So effectively now it'll work just like a regular SX-70. You just hit the shutter button when you want to. We've got exposure compensation. Works completely like normal. Just that the camera is now calibrated for 600 type film by default. So when you're not using the Bluetooth functionality, when you're not using the dongle, the camera really just works like a 600 film converted SX-70. Which is really, really neat. I think that functionality alone makes this camera worth it, right? Makes this modification worth it. The fact that you've now got a brand new, reliable, super accurate PCB controlling the camera is just really cool, especially if your original camera's PCB happens to be dead, which isn't super common, but does happen. I mean, the electronics are 50 years old in these things. It's nice to have a modern replacement. Now, the real fun begins when you start to use the manual control. Here I'm demonstrating the Android app, and effectively what this app does is now give you manual control over the camera's shutter. Now, the way that the shutter speeds are demonstrated and written down is using the lens's f8 as a reference and then giving you an effective shutter speed. And the effective shutter speeds will be all the way from 1/8000 down to 2 seconds when using the app. And basically this gives you manual control over the camera's EV values. So for example, we select a 1/30th of a second here. We can then either hit the button on the camera or we can use the app like a remote control. The app also gives us countdown timer functionality, so let's give this a little 5-second countdown. There you go, so that was a 5-second countdown. And yeah, the app also provides features like time mode. Like I said, all the way, you've got auto, 2 seconds, all the way up to 1/8000th. The other thing that you can do is change the ISO setting, and you can set it to SX-70 film or 600 film when you're using automatic modes. Now, on that subject of the shutter speed, I do want to emphasize here that the shutter speeds that you just saw in the app are effective shutter speeds. And the reason that they are written down as such is to make metering using a handheld light meter easier. So effectively what you're going to be doing is setting your film ISO. You then use F8 as the reference and basically just select whatever speed the light meter tells you to do. So for example, if I turn this on, we match up the needles. So we use F8 as a reference. That means to take a photo right in front of me, I'm going to set this thing to about 1/30th of a second or 1/25th, whatever is closest. Now, the way the SX-70 shutter works is it uses two blades that slide past one another, and there is no real way to separate true aperture and shutter speed. And that's because of the SX-70 shutter's design. There's no real way to separate aperture from shutter speed. The SX-70 shutter uses a combined design that works off of EV values. As I'm explaining this, I'm going to be showing a bit of B-roll footage of what SX-70 blades look like when they slide past one another. Effectively, the SX-70 shutter fires at a fixed rate, and depending on how long the shutter blades are held open for, the aperture will change because the opening for those aperture blades is a teardrop shape. So if it's a very fast exposure, it's going to be a tiny little pinhole worth of light. If it's a slower exposure, the lens is going to be open closer to F8, right? Certainly anything above 1/25th of a second, you're using the F8 aperture. But that is why it's written down like that. It's mainly just to make using a handheld light meter easier. Personally, I just prefer to think about it as using EV values. So effectively using the app, you can do anything from EV19 right the way down to, EV, very, very low EV values. Using the dedicated dongle, you can go all the way down to EV1, which is such a wide range to have EV1 to EV19. But yeah, I wouldn't worry so much about what the shutter is doing. Just meter as normal and use the reference as what's written on the little display or on your app, and the camera will expose perfectly fine. The reason that I bring this up is this particular camera, the SX-70R, has very similar functionality to MiNT's time machine camera, and MiNT, who are based in Hong Kong, that company specifically advertises their camera as being capable of a 1/2000th shutter speed. And they really, as of their website right now, as I'm recording this video, they describe their camera as being the fastest Polaroid ever. And that just simply isn't true. No SX-70 can do 1/2000th of a second or 1/4000th or 1/8000th. It's an effective measurement. So I just wanted to digress there because I do think it is important to emphasize that. I would actually argue that MiNT's way of advertising their time machine is kind of false advertising. You'd be hard pressed to find any leaf shutter that could do over 1/500th of a second, let alone 1/8000th. So just a little digression there. But the manual features are still incredibly handy. Being able to control the precise EV value of what your handheld meter means, of what your handheld meter is measuring, means that you can control exactly which point of light you want to capture. You want to capture the shadows? Meter for the shadows. You want to capture highlights? Well, meter for the highlights. It's really up to you. So let's talk a bit about the dedicated dongle that goes with the camera. This dongle is effectively, you can think about it like a Bluetooth remote control. It's going to connect to that little Bluetooth module just like the app did, but it has the added advantage of being able to be inserted into the flash socket, which gives this some PC flash sync through use of a little 3.5mm jack, and that's very handy for firing studio strobes. I'll go a bit more into the flash functionality in just a second, but let's talk a little about the dongle first. When you connect it for the first time, you just simply hold the little button in and turn the power on, and it's going to say match. Once it's matched to your Bluetooth PCB for the first time, you won't have to worry about it matching again. It'll simply match every single time you go to turn it on. You really only have to do that for the first time. Once it is turned on, you'll be greeted with a little settings on the OLED screen. The settings basically give you automatic mode. They give you then control of the manual settings. And as I said before, the way these settings are laid out, they use F8 as the reference point and then lists the shutter speeds for you to choose from. So when you're hand holding your little handheld light meter, you basically just use F8 as the reference. Now, this light meter also includes in that little OLED display little arrows and a circle. Effectively, what they mean is if you're over or under exposing, right? Once it's set to the circle, it is the correct exposure. And that is because this dongle, one of the advantages, it has a light meter built into the front that you can actually use to meter the scene. You could, let's say if you found a highlight that you wanted to, you can actually take the dongle off the camera and point it to whatever you want to measure and actually get a manual reading before you put it back on the camera. It's incredibly handy to have. But yeah, once you found your correct setting, if it's at the correct exposure, it'll show a little circle. If you're over or under, it'll demonstrate with a little arrow. Of course, you could just use a handheld meter and ignore the little built-in one if you wanted to. Totally up to you. So I've just set this to, let's say I've set this to 1/4 of a second. You just hit the shutter button like normal. Let's really slow that down. Let's go a 1 second exposure just so that you can see just how it's working. Right, so we can see it's clearly firing at 1 second. And as I said before, it actually works like a remote control. It doesn't need to be attached. There's actually a little button on the remote control itself, which is really cool. The main advantage of the dongle, as I said before, is it gives you flash sync. And flash sync is obtained through a little connector. So here I have a little hot shoe with a PC sync cable. I have a little cheap Yongnuo flash, so I'm just going to turn that on. And then I've got a 3.5mm jack to PC connector. I'm just going to insert that into the dongle. It will click once it's in place. Make sure it goes in all the way or it won't synchronize. We can then plug in our sync cable and plug in the flash. Let's turn up the brightness a bit. Just have the flash facing the camera. And there are actually a few additional settings that we can set the dongle to when we're using flash mode. So the scroll wheel on the side that lets us change settings, if you click that inwards, instead of listing the effective shutter speeds, it's now going to list the effective aperture that the camera uses. So let's set it, say, to f11 here. We're going to make sure this little flash button on the top is selected to the left-hand side. And it'll sync. Now, the switch at the top on the dongle labeled flash, when you leave it in the off position, the camera will use whatever aperture you've set on the OLED screen. If you turn this flash mode on, it turns on the SX-70's distance-based aperture, because the way that an SX-70 usually works during flash mode is the aperture is dictated depending on what you're focusing on. So if you focus really close, it's going to use a tiny aperture. If you're focused at infinity, it uses a very large aperture. So if you want that automatic setting, you just turn that function on, and it's going to function just like the original SX-70 would. And basically, you just need a flash with the appropriate guide number that's in the manual. I believe it's guide number 18. And you can just fire the flash, and it'll change the aperture based on distance. If you're in a studio environment, though, that's when I'd recommend turn the distance-based flash off and just use the manual settings instead. So yeah, really, really handy stuff. It gives you a lot of control. Like I said, if you want to have an on-camera flash and hook up a little bracket, you can just use the distance-based aperture. Or if you're using studio strobes, turn the distance-based aperture off, set it manually, and you'll get perfect exposures. The last feature I want to talk about on the dongle is this switch over here, and that manually selects between, on the automatic mode, SX-70 or 600 speed film. So to the left means that on auto it'll be set for SX-70 film. Flick it over to the right and it's going to be set for 600 speed film. So when you turn the dongle on and the camera is powered up, it's going to scan and it will tell you what ISO it's using. So it says there ISO 125, and then on auto, this will now be set for SX-70 speed film. So this is really handy if you like shooting both formats. You can manually select 600 film, you can choose SX-70 film, or you can just choose to completely ignore that and meter by hand using the manual settings. So it's really versatile. This particular dongle that I'm demonstrating is one of the earlier generations. I am talking with the creator of the dongle to make a few little changes, so you may see a few revisions in the future. Inside this dongle is a lithium-ion battery that is charged via USB-C, which is just on the side here is a little USB-C connector. The power on the dongle must be in the on position for that charger to work properly. So I'll just grab a little USB cable here. Then when you plug it in, a little red light will turn on indicating charging. And you can see how much battery is in the dongle by having a look at the length of the line underneath the numbers. Basically, the shorter that line gets, the less power the battery has. These dongles are also very easy to open up and repair. There are only 4 screws, and the soldering points are big enough that they could have parts replaced by hand if they do break. One of the main changes that I believe is coming, having a chat to Carlisle personally, is I believe that he's going to make the switches bigger on the top in further future generations. Currently they use little Alps brand switches, and they're very easy to flick just with your fingernails, but I think he is going to make them larger just to make it that little bit easier to use. Now the last thing I wanted to cover here is, well, what if you want to use this with an SLR680? Well, the SLR680 works in much the same way. You'll be able to use the dedicated phone app to control all the manual settings. And the only real difference with the SLR680 is that obviously there's no flash socket on an SLR680. So what that means is, although technically you could purchase a dongle and use it as if it was a remote control, let's say, you don't necessarily want to rely on your phone all the time, you'd like to have something dedicated that can control the camera, you could certainly purchase the dongle to pair with an SLR680. However, just bear in mind, since the SLR680 does not have a flash socket, you won't be able to use the PC strobe functionality. So you won't be able to use the studio lights, but the new PCB does work with the SLR680's built-in flash. So you can still use flash functionality, it's just you won't have manual control over the external strobes, unless you synchronized it with, say one of those optical slaves, where it would pick up the camera's flash and use that to trigger strobe. So it would still technically be possible, you just wouldn't be able to do it through PC sync cable. That's really the only difference. The SX-70R PCB can be installed into any SLR type Polaroid camera. There is a specific PCB for sonar models with autofocus, and there's a specific PCB for those without autofocus. Effectively, that means you can have these PCBs installed into an SX-70 Model 1, a Model 2, even a Model 3 if you really wanted to. Not that I'd recommend that, being that it isn't a true SLR. You can also install it into an SX-70 Alpha, you can install it into an SX-70 Sonar, and the SLR-680. The only SLR camera that you can't install these PCBs into is the Japanese-made SLR-690, and that's because that has a completely different set of electronics inside that are not compatible with these boards. In fact, the SLR-690 is not really compatible with any electronics from a standard model SX-70. So yeah, if you have a Model 1, Model 2, Model 3, an Alpha, a Sonar, or an SLR-680, then you are in luck. You can use the new Bluetooth SX-70R PCBs. If you have a 690, unfortunately, you are out of luck. So if you would like your camera converted to take these new SX-70R PCBs, and you'd like me to do the job, well, I'm happy to do so for you. Simply contact me using any of the links down below in the comments, and we'll have a chat and see what we can do in terms of refurbishing your camera. I'd like to thank you for watching the video, and hopefully the explanation of what the SX-70R and the dongle are capable of helps illustrate just the incredible amounts of technology that are going into salvaging and keeping these SX-70 cameras alive for years to come. I've linked down below on my Instagram in the highlights at the very top of my profile. I've actually created a specific highlight reel for the SX-70R, which basically outlines everything that I've just said in words as sort of a physical documentation, should you still find any of this stuff confusing. When it comes to manual control of SX-70s, they can be a little tricky to wrap your head around, but as long as you remember that what this does is gives you manual control over the EV values of the original shutter, then yeah, if you're someone that likes manually controlling your camera, you're going to really enjoy this. One of the things that I actually did with this specific camera, I lent this to a fellow photographer here in Western Australia named Ashley, and she was able to use it for a few weeks and take some sample photos. She sent those to me, so I'm going to leave you guys with a bit of a gallery of all the work that she was able to do using my camera. She found it incredibly intuitive, easy to use, and ultimately ended up getting great results. Well, until the next video, you've been a wonderful audience. Remember, at the stage of me releasing this video, my channel's still fairly in its infancy. So I'd always appreciate a like, a subscribe, or a comment, or simply, if you want to help support a small local business, feel free to send one of your cameras to me to be repaired. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and happy shooting!